May 5, 1945. Tyrol, Austria. As the guns of Europe were about to fall silent, one final battle was still simmering, small in scale but monumental in meaning. On a high hill overlooking Tyrol's green valley, a strange group of people prepared to enter the last battle of their lives. Americans, Germans, French, and even those who were once bitter enemies, now standing side by side, all facing an ancient stone gate, moss-covered by time. Castle Itter. 3 days earlier, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in a bunker beneath the city. The Third Reich had collapsed. American and Soviet armies were closing in on the heart of Germany from both sides. But in the western mountains of Austria, thousands of Waffen-SS fighters, fanatics, still refused to surrender. To them, the war wasn't over, and anyone willing to lay down their arms was a traitor. In that setting, 27-year-old Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr., commander of an M4A3 Sherman tank nicknamed Besotten Jenny, stood by the Inn River near the town of Kufstein, Austria. He came from Norwich, New York, the son of a farmer and a graduate of Norwich Military Academy in Vermont. After 5 months marching through France and Germany, Lee had become a seasoned commander, awarded the Bronze Star for his bravery. For Lee, the war was almost over. He and his unit, Company B, 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, were only a few days away from being pulled back to the rear. But that morning, an unexpected encounter changed everything. From the south, a German Kübelwagen command car approached, flying a white flag. Behind the wheel was Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, an artillery officer in the Wehrmacht, Hitler's army. He had fought from Kiev to Normandy, from Ukraine to Bastogne, but now he no longer fought for Hitler. Seeing his Austrian homeland in ruins, Gangl had decided to betray the regime he once served. He joined the Austrian resistance in the town of Wörgl, trying to stop the Waffen-SS from murdering civilians waving white flags of surrender. As the car stopped in front of the American lines, rifles instantly aimed at it. For a few tense seconds, both sides were frozen. But Gangl stepped out, holding a white flag, his voice shaking with emotion. He hadn't come to surrender. He came to plead for help. Through a translator, Gangl said, 8 kilometers from here, there's an old castle. Inside are 14 French prisoners, former prime ministers, generals, and the sister of Charles de Gaulle. SS troops are closing in to kill them. I need your help. John Lee was stunned. It sounded like a fantasy, a German officer begging Americans to rescue French prisoners from the Nazis. But Gangl's eyes told the truth, and Lee understood. If they didn't act immediately, those people would be executed before nightfall. He looked over at his tank. Besotten Jenny, the 6.7-meter-long, nearly 33-ton steel beast, armed with a 76mm M1A1 cannon and a 50-cal Browning machine gun. This machine had carried him from the Normandy landings, across the Rhine, through burning German cities. Now, it would carry him into the final battle. Lee didn't hesitate. He grabbed the radio and called headquarters at the 12th Armored Division, requesting permission for the rescue mission. The order came back short and clear. Approved. Your call, Captain Lee. That afternoon, in the square of Kufstein, an unusual army gathered. A Sherman tank named Besotten Jenny. 6 American soldiers from Company D, 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, including black troops, men fighting for freedom, even while their own country remained divided. Around 10 German soldiers under Major Gangl, men who had just turned against the Third Reich. And a Kübelwagen leading the way, carrying a Croatian electrician named Zvonimir Chuchkovic, who had escaped the castle to find help. An unimaginable alliance had formed. Americans, Germans, Austrians, and Croatians, all heading toward a distant hill, where a medieval fortress named Schloss Itter awaited. Up there, 14 French figures were waiting, including Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, two former prime ministers once at odds in Paris, Jean Borotra, Wimbledon tennis champion, Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, sister of Charles de Gaulle, and Michel Clemenceau, son of Old Tiger, Georges Clemenceau. They had no idea their rescuers wore two different uniforms, and that the American flag would soon wave beside a German officer who had turned against Hitler. On the Sherman Besotten, Jenny, Lieutenant John Lee fired up the engine. The 500-horsepower motor roared, shaking the ground. An American holding a white flag and a German holding a rifle climbed onto the turret. They looked at each other, said nothing. No words were needed. In that moment, they understood that doing the right thing wasn't in the orders. It was in their conscience. On the afternoon of May 4th, 1945, the small convoy departed Kufstein and entered the Tyrolean mountains. Ahead lay 8 kilometers of winding, narrow road, across bridges, through forests, and through the shadows of a dying empire. They didn't know what awaited them, only that at the end of the road there were people who needed saving. And so, on the final afternoon of the European War, a strange march began. A march that history would come to call the Last Battle. Amid the snow-capped Tyrolean mountains, there is a 666-meter-high hill where rock and forest intertwine like the scars of time. At its summit stands a towering medieval structure amidst the clouds, Castle Itter. Locals call it Schloss Itter, a fortress dating back to the 13th century. By the early 20th century, it was no longer a defensive post, but a luxurious hotel, a summer retreat for Austrian nobility. But history, as always, would not leave ancient walls in peace. In 1938, when Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany during the Anschluss, Castle Itter fell into German hands. On February 7, 1943, by order of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, the site was confiscated and converted into a special prison under the authority of Dachau. The man overseeing the transformation was General Oswald Pohl, the architect of the entire Nazi concentration camp system. Unlike the hellscapes of Dachau or Auschwitz, Itter was reserved for France's most valuable hostages, former high-ranking figures the Nazis intended to use as political leverage. In May 1943, the first prisoners arrived. They were not soldiers, but names that had once shaken Europe. Édouard Daladier, 60, former French prime minister who signed the Munich Agreement in 1938 to prevent war, later arrested by the Vichy government and handed over to the Germans. Paul Reynaud, 66, Daladier's successor, a prime minister who defiantly resisted surrender in 1940, now imprisoned alongside his former political rival. General Maurice Gamelin, 72, France's commander-in-chief at the outset of the war. General Maxime Weygand, 78, the man who signed the armistice with Germany. Jean Borotra, 46, legendary tennis player and two-time Wimbledon champion. Léon Jouhaux, 65, labor union leader and future Nobel Peace Prize winner, 1951. François de la Roque, right-wing Croix de Feu, leader and former adversary of Jouhaux. Michel Clemenceau, 71, son of the Old Tiger, Georges Clemenceau. And Marie-Agnès Caillot de Gaulle, sister of Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the French resistance. Together they formed a miniature France, left-wing and right-wing, republicans and monarchists, all imprisoned beneath the same ancient roof. SS guards often mocked them. You argued your whole lives, now eat gruel together. But Itter was unlike other prison camps. The prisoners stayed in the castle's former hotel rooms, complete with beds and windows overlooking the forest. Some guards, for reasons unknown, retained a shred of humanity, allowing the prisoners to read books, walk in the courtyard, and even establish a small library for mental stability. One guard allowed Daladier to hide a small radio. Through it, he secretly listened to the BBC, Hearing that Normandy had been liberated, Paris was free, and Berlin was collapsing. That news became the only light in their darkness. As the war neared its end, tension inside the castle rose sharply. Distant American artillery could be heard, and everyone understood. Freedom was approaching, but so was death. In many places, SS troops had begun massacring prisoners to erase the evidence. Itter was no exception. In April 1945, rumors spread quickly. Waffen-SS units retreating through Tyrol were prepared to kill anyone who surrendered. On April 30, 1945, the news of Hitler's suicide reached the castle, and Captain Sebastian Wimmer, the prison commander, panicked and fled with all the guards. Castle Itter fell into an eerie silence. The gates remained locked, but no one was left to watch them. Inside were just 14 French prisoners and a few Eastern European workers. Prisoner Jean Barotra whispered, "If they don't come back, we're free." But General Weygand replied, "No, Jean. If the SS finds out, they'll come and kill us all." He was right. Just hours later, the sound of trucks echoed from the east. The SS was coming. Those inside the castle knew they had only one chance. They had to reach the Americans before the SS reached them. That night, Zvonimir Chuchkovic, a Croatian electrician who had worked at the castle, volunteered to leave. He carried no weapon, only a hastily written note in German and French. "French prisoners are being held at Itter. The SS is coming to kill them. Please help us." Into the Tyrolean fog, Zvonimir disappeared. He didn't know if he would survive, only that each step he took was the only hope for 14 lives. And no one inside the castle knew that at dawn the next day, in a place called Innsbruck, he would find the first American. A rescue had begun, not driven by generals or strategy, but by the courage of an ordinary man. Night of May 3rd, 1945. Fog blanketed the Tyrolean mountains. Inside the ancient Itter castle, a lone oil lamp flickered faintly, casting shadows on weary faces. The French prisoners, once powerful figures in Paris, now sat around a wooden table, silently listening to the wind howling through the cracks in the stone walls. Outside, the world was changing faster than they could believe. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. But the war was not over. The remnants of the Waffen-SS, fanatical loyalists, still roamed the mountains, hunting down anyone who dared to surrender or betray the Reich. They shot at any white flag hanging from windows, killing Austrian civilians simply for wanting peace. In that moment, a thin electrician named Zvonimir Chuchkovic stood up. He was Croatian, a former prisoner at Dachau, later assigned to Itter to do electrical repairs. He understood the situation better than anyone, and he also understood that if no one acted, everyone inside the castle would be executed by the SS before the Americans could arrive. He told the group in broken German, "I'll go. I know the way to Virgil. Maybe I can find the Americans." Former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud looked at him and slowly nodded. "If you don't come back, we'll remember your name." Zvonimir carried no weapon, only a hastily written note in French and German. "High-ranking French prisoners held at Castle Itter. SS coming to kill them. Please help us." That night, he slipped through the castle gate and descended the slippery mountain road, carrying the only hope of 14 lives. The journey from Itter to Innsbruck was over 60 kilometers, through territory crawling with retreating SS troops. He had to avoid patrols, checkpoints, and pass through Austrian villages, where terrified locals no longer knew who was friend and who was foe. On the road he saw homes with white flags burned down, men tied to trees for betraying the Reich. But he kept walking, in silence, as distant artillery echoed through the hills. By dawn, on May 4th, 1945, after nearly 20 hours of continuous movement, Zvonimir reached the outskirts of Innsbruck. There, he encountered a reconnaissance unit from the 49th Infantry Regiment, 103rd Infantry Division, part of the U.S. 6th Corps. As American soldiers raised their rifles, he threw up his hands and shouted in broken English, "French prisoners! SS killed them! Need help!" Their commander, Major John T. Kramers, listened and immediately grasped the importance of what he heard. If the man was telling the truth, those prisoners were part of France's history. Kramers quickly ordered an armored rescue force, tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry to mobilize. But as the convoy passed through Jenbach, they came under SS artillery fire from the hills. Staff officers, concerned about overstepping the boundaries of the 36th Division's sector, ordered a retreat. The rescue mission stalled, with only 2 light jeeps continuing forward, far too few to make a difference. Left behind, Zvonimir stood helpless in the road. He couldn't return to Itter. The SS had closed in, but he wasn't ready to give up. And it was in that moment that fate brought him face to face with the man who could change everything. By noon on May 4th, in the town of Würgel, about 8 kilometers from Castle Itter, a German soldier in gray uniform stood on the balcony of the town hall. He was Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, 36, a Wehrmacht artillery officer. Gangl had once been a hardened warrior. He'd fought at Kiev, 1941, Normandy, 1944, and Bastogne, 1944-45. But now he no longer believed in victory, nor in Hitler. What he had witnessed over 4 years, villages leveled, prisoners executed, civilians beaten, convinced him that the Reich he served had lost its soul. When the SS began shooting Austrians for flying white flags, Gangl made a decision he once thought impossible. He disobeyed Nazi orders. He gathered 10 to 20 German soldiers, exhausted, disillusioned men, and joined the Austrian resistance led by Alois Meyer in Würgel. Their mission: protect civilians from SS massacres. That afternoon, Zvonimir arrived in Würgel. Exhausted, clothes torn, he struggled to explain the situation to Gangl in broken German. "French prisoners, in Castle Itter. SS will kill them. Need American soldiers." Gangl was silent for a few seconds, then asked, "How far?" 8 kilometers, on the hill to the north." No further explanation was needed. Gangl understood immediately. If he could rescue those French prisoners, some of the most important figures in France, he would not only be saving lives, but redeeming a part of Germany's honor. But with only 10 soldiers and a few rifles, he knew he couldn't face the hundreds of SS troops surrounding the area. He needed allies, and he knew where to find them. Late on May 4th, Gangl tied a large white flag to a Kübelwagen command car and drove himself, bringing Zvonimir as interpreter. They headed for Kufstein, where American forces from the 12th Armored Division had just taken control. It was a dangerous move. Any German officer seen carrying a white flag could be executed on the spot by SS patrols, but Gangl was resolute. "If I have to die," he told Zvonimir, "at least today I'll die on the right side." In Kufstein's main square, American soldiers spotted the German vehicle approaching. They raised their rifles, ready to fire. But as the white flag fluttered, their commander ordered them to hold. Gangl stepped out of the vehicle, hands raised, his face still dusty from the road. He asked to see the American commander. Moments later, he was brought to Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr., commander of a platoon of M4A3 Sherman tanks from the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. The young American officer, only 27, looked at the German standing before him, a man he had fought for the past 6 months, and said nothing. Gangl, with limited English, briefly explained, "Castle Itter, 14 French, SS coming. My men and I want to help." Lee was silent for a moment, then looked him straight in the eye. "You're saying, you, a German officer, want to fight with us?" "Yes, with you, against the SS." No ceremony, no paperwork, just 2 soldiers, 1 American, 1 German, shaking hands in the ruins of Austria. In that moment, history changed course. That night, Lee gave the order to form a rescue force, the M4A3 Sherman tank Besotten Jenny, commanded by Lee himself. A second tank, Boche Buster, driven by Lieutenant Wallace Holbrook. 6 American infantrymen from Company D, 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, including black soldiers. About 10 of Gangel's German troops, armed and riding in trucks. Zvonimir sat in the front seat of the Kübelwagen, acting as guide. A military force like no other in history was ready to move, where German and American uniforms stood side by side, and the mission wasn't conquest, but rescue. Outside, the Tyrolean sky darkened. Sunset reflected off the steel hull of Besotten Jenny. As the 500 horsepower engine roared to life, John Lee spoke quietly into his radio. "All units head to Itter. No one gets left behind." And so, on the night of May 4th, 1945, a small convoy rolled across a dying battlefield toward what history would call the final battle of Europe. On the afternoon of May 4th, 1945, the sky over Kufstein, Austria, was shrouded in a light mist. The roar of American tank engines echoed like the heartbeat of a giant steel beast. Leading the convoy was the M4A3 Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, commanded by 27-year-old Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee, Jr. Beside him, in a gray Kübelwagen command car, sat Wehrmacht Major Josef Sepp Gangel, silently gazing north, toward the hill of Itter, cloaked in thick fog. Just hours earlier, they had stood on opposite sides of the war. Now they shared a single mission: to rescue the French prisoners held in the castle. Accompanying Lee were 6 soldiers from Company D, 17th Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. Young Americans, most barely out of high school for less than 2 years. Among them were black soldiers, fighting for freedom even though equality in their homeland remained unfinished. Behind the lead tank followed a second Sherman, Boche Buster, operated by Lieutenant Wallace Holbrook, along with several trucks carrying 10 of Gangel's German soldiers, men who had renounced their oath to Hitler to protect Austrian civilians. And at the very front, riding in the lead Kübelwagen, was Croatian electrician Zvonimir Chuchkovic, who had risked his life to cross more than 60 kilometers in search of help. A coalition never before seen in history. Americans, Germans, Croatians, united by a mission to save lives rather than take them. The distance from Kufstein to Itter was only about 8 kilometers, but the road was winding, narrow, and fraught with danger. On either side were pine forests, deep ravines, and fragile wooden bridges. Any ambush from the Waffen-SS could easily destroy the small convoy. The lead Sherman ground its tracks around each bend, while the white flag on Gangel's vehicle flapped in the wind. Austrians along the way looked on in astonishment, seeing German soldiers traveling alongside American tanks. They didn't know what was happening, only that something was changing. At the bridge over the Inn River, Lee halted. The bridge was too weak to bear the full weight of the convoy. He ordered 5 reinforcement tanks from the 142nd Regiment, 36th Division, to turn back, keeping only the 2 Shermans. A risky decision, meaning they would proceed with fewer than 40 men, facing hundreds of SS troops hidden somewhere in the Tyrolean forest. But Lee didn't hesitate. Over the radio, he simply said, "If we don't go, they'll die tonight." The convoy moved on. Just after leaving the town of Jenbach, they were ambushed. An SS MG-42 opened fire from the high ground. Bullets sparked against the Sherman's armor. Lee immediately swung the turret. His 76mm cannon roared, blasting the machine gun nest. Shards of metal flew, and silence returned. The convoy didn't stop. It sped up and entered Vurgel, where the townspeople were already hanging white flags in surrender. In front of the town hall, Gangl paused to meet an old friend, Alois Mayer, leader of the Austrian resistance. He handed over half of his men to defend the town, then turned to Mayer and quietly said, "If I don't come back, tell my son his father died for the right thing." He then climbed back into the vehicle and continued the journey. The road to Itter Castle grew narrower and steeper. 2 kilometers from the castle, they found a small bridge rigged with explosives. Gangl and 2 German soldiers crawled forward and silently cut the detonation wires. One misstep would have meant death for them all, but they succeeded. By 6 p.m., the convoy reached the base of Itter Hill. At the summit, the castle loomed, dark and solitary amid the forest. Inside, the French prisoners heard the engines and feared the SS had arrived to execute them. They rushed to the walls, ready to fight. But when they saw the American flag painted on the Sherman turret and Zvonimir waving from below, they realized a miracle had come. The large iron gates swung open. Besotten Jenny rolled into the courtyard, its heavy frame trembling on the stone ground. The French rushed out. Paul Reynaud, former Prime Minister, grabbed Lee's hand, voice trembling. "You are our angels." Edouard Daladier, once Reynaud's political rival, followed, eyes red. In that moment, all past grudges vanished. Lee looked around, stunned. Before him were not just prisoners, but a piece of France's history. 2 prime ministers, 2 generals, a Wimbledon champion, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and Charles de Gaulle's sister. He whispered, "If we fail, Europe will lose an entire generation of leaders." There was no time for emotion. From afar, through the woods, came the sounds of trucks, shouting and clanking metal. Scouts reported SS forces gathering to the south, preparing to attack. Their numbers were estimated at 120 to 150 troops, armed with machine guns, mortars, and at least one 88 millipowder flak cannon. Lee immediately ordered the castle fortified. Besotten Jenny was positioned at the front gate, its cannon aimed down the road. American and German soldiers took up defensive positions, erected barricades, and set up machine guns for crossfire. Inside, the French prisoners refused to hide. General Maxime Weygand held a rifle, while General Maurice Gamelin took a post by the western wall. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion of Wimbledon fame, donned a leather jacket and gripped an MP40. Léon Jouot and François de la Roque, once far-right and unionist political rivals, sat side by side, loading magazines. Lee urged them to retreat to the underground bunker, but Daladier looked him straight in the eye and firmly said, "Lieutenant, this is France. We will fight for honor." Lee nodded quietly. Outside, night began to fall. Mountain mist blanketed the old stone walls. The wind whistling through the pines sounded like the breath of war. Through the night, they heard the SS forces moving, orders shouted, weapons clinking. Lee made rounds to every post, checked ammunition, and reminded everyone not to shoot unless certain. In a small room, the French sat around a table, silent. Marie-Agnès de Gaulle wrote in her notebook, "We don't know if we'll live to see morning, but strangely tonight I feel safer than ever." In the corridor, Jean Borotra whispered to Lee, "If they come by morning, I'll run to find reinforcements." Lee shook his head. "If you run, they'll shoot you on sight." Borotra smiled. "I used to run at Wimbledon. Maybe I'm still faster than them." The two chuckled softly, then fell silent. Outside, flashes lit the hillside, not lightning, but artillery fire. The final battle of Europe was near. Morning mist blanketed the Tyrolean forest. Castle Itter stood silently among the clouds, its stone walls damp with dew. Inside, Lieutenant John C. Jack. Lee Jr. stood atop the turret of the Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, eyes fixed on the winding road snaking up from the valley below. Beneath the pines, German and American soldiers took turns on watch. They knew the SS were out there somewhere. Then, the first explosion rang out. A mortar shell screamed through the air and detonated just outside the gate, showering the earth in debris. The battle had begun. From the southern slope, more than 100 Waffen-SS troops launched their first assault. Black uniforms melted into the mist as they advanced swiftly and silently. MG-42 machine guns erupted, spraying bullets that sparked off the castle's stone walls. "Besotten Jenny," answered back. Its 70 6mm cannon thundered, tearing into the enemy ranks, sending smoke high into the trees. But the SS did not retreat. They pressed closer. Gangel's German soldiers held the front gate, while the Americans spread along the castle walls. Inside, the French prisoners, Daladier, Reynaud, Gamelin, Weygand, Borotra, took up arms. Once politicians and generals, now they were comrades. There were no factions now, only survival. For the first 2 hours, the SS attacked relentlessly. Flak 88 shells slammed into the castle, shattering stones and filling the air with dust. One round struck the auxiliary turret of Besotten Jenny, forcing Lee to order the tank pulled deeper into the courtyard. With the steel barrier gone, the SS surged toward the gate. Lee, Gangel, and Schrader took up positions. English and German orders rang out amidst the gunfire. Americans fired, Germans reloaded, Frenchmen relayed messages. A strange alliance of former enemies, now fighting as one. On the east wall, Jean Borotra emptied a magazine and shouted with a grin, "This castle isn't a prison anymore, it's my tennis court." In the courtyard, Gangel ran between positions, commanding and assisting. Seeing Reynaud exposed in a window, he rushed to pull him back to cover. A sniper's bullet struck him in the neck. Gangel collapsed on the stone steps, blood soaking into the ancient stone. He died in the arms of the very Frenchman he had just saved. Lee clenched his fist, but there was no time to grieve. The SS tightened their grip. Mortar shells rained down, and the west wall was breached. Ammunition ran low. Gangel's men were down to 8. The Americans had only a few clips left. Lee tried to radio Virgil, but interference jammed the signal. Then Jean Borotra stepped forward, voice firm. "I'll go for reinforcements. I'm faster than their bullets." Lee protested, but Borotra just smiled. "I once dodged 200 km/h serves. I might still outrun the SS." Without waiting, he jumped from the wall and sprinted down the slope through gunfire. SS bullets followed him, but he disappeared into the pine trees. Inside the castle, everyone held their breath. If he was caught, the SS would know how desperate their situation truly was. By midday, the SS launched their largest assault yet. They stormed from 3 directions, hurling grenades and hammering the gate with gunfire. Besotten Jenny took more hits. Smoke now poured from her turret. Lee ordered everyone to fall back to the ground floor. Combat at close quarters. The dining room, hallways, staircases, every corridor became a front line. Just as ammunition ran low, a deep, familiar sound echoed in the distance. Heavy engines, metal treads grinding the road. Then came the whistles of artillery fire. Shells exploded on the hillside. American tanks from the 142nd Regiment, 36th Infantry Division had arrived, thanks to Borotra. As the reinforcements appeared, the SS panicked and scattered. Some surrendered. Others were cut down. Castle Itter still stood. Its walls cracked but not broken. The final battle in Europe was over. In the courtyard, survivors gathered amid smoke and rubble. Lee, his face coated in dust, looked around. An American soldier, a group of German defectors, and French prisoners who had just reclaimed their freedom. There was no cheering, no laughter, only silence as they all bowed their heads before the body of Sepp Gangl, who had died for honor. That afternoon, church bells rang from Wörgl, the first sound of peace. One day later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. But at Itter, the miracle had come early, where Americans, Germans, and French had fought together, not for conquest, but for life. Late afternoon atop Tyrol, the wind began to die down, and smoke lifted into the clear air of a new day. The survivors stepped out of the ancient castle, gazing down at the valley where sunlight bathed the rooftops of Wörgl. They had saved their lives, but more than that, they had proven that even in the deepest darkness, the light of humanity can still shine. Around them were scarred stone walls, the fallen bodies of SS soldiers scattered across the hillside. The battle was over, but what they had endured was more than combat. It was a testament that courage and conscience bear no flag. Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee, Jr., the young commander from New York, quietly looked at the scorched hull of besotten Jenny. He had lost a German comrade, Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, once an officer of the Third Reich, who chose to die protecting those he was taught to hate. Lee returned to America after the war, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. But to him, the true reward was the moment he saw German soldiers, American GIs, and French prisoners sharing their first cigarette in freedom. Sepp Gangl never lived to see peace. He was buried with honor by the Austrian people, and the town of Wörgl named a street after him, Sepp Gangl-Strasse, in memory of the German officer who died for honor. His story became a symbol of late but righteous resistance, of Germans who dared to say no to evil. The French prisoners, Daladier, Reynaud, Gamelin, Weygand, Borotra, Jouhaux, Clemenceau, and Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, returned to Paris. The two former prime ministers, Daladier and Reynaud, once bitter rivals, shook hands before the press. Jean Borotra, who had sprinted through a storm of bullets to bring reinforcements, became a symbol of bravery. He later said simply, "I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done." Generals Weygand and Gamelin, once criticized, were now respected for standing and fighting to the end. Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, sister of General Charles de Gaulle, returned quietly to France. But her words, written the night before the battle: "I don't know if I will live to see morning, but I feel at peace tonight," are still quoted as a testament of faith in the face of darkness. After the war, many of them helped shape the new peace in Europe. They understood that only cooperation and forgiveness could secure the future. In the United States, the Black Soldiers of Company D, 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, returned home to a country where their freedom was still incomplete. Yet they stood as living symbols of the American spirit, placing duty and justice above all borders. SS Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader, once sworn to Hitler, but who chose humanity at Itter, was captured after the war. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but had his term reduced due to his actions at the castle. He lived until 1995. In a final interview, he said, "That day, I didn't fight for Germany. I fought for my conscience." After the war, Castle Itter was returned to its original owners, later becoming private property. There is no monument, no museum, only the quiet stone walls still overlooking the valley, where, in 1945, former enemies stood side by side in the fight for life. In the town of Wörgl, locals still tell their children about the strangest battle in history, where Americans, Germans, French, Austrians, and a Croatian stood together against the final echoes of war. The story was brought to global light by Stephen Harding in his 2013 book, The Last Battle. Harding wrote, "In the final hours of the bloodiest war, there was a place where reason rose above hate, and honor became the only shared language. Later, the band Sabaton composed The Last Battle, helping younger generations remember that even in war, humanity never truly dies. Today, looking back, people understand that Itter was not just a battle. It was proof of something greater than victory, that people can change, enemies can shake hands, and good can still exist amid evil. For America, Itter was not a large-scale operation, but it embodied the very ideals Americans believe in, that freedom, justice, and compassion are always worth fighting for. For Europe, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, where former foes came together to build peace. In Tyrol, as dusk falls, the last sunlight still touches those ancient stone walls, once bearing the footsteps of men from 4 nations. They didn't know they'd be remembered, but every one of them chose the right side. The battle lasted only a few hours, but its echo remains eternal, a reminder that even when the world falls apart, there will always be those who hold on to hope. And because of them, this world still has a chance.